So for centuries, the greatest minds in history, and I mean people like Plato and the towering intellects of ancient Greece, they actually believed that you had laser vision.
Right, yeah. They genuinely did.
Like they genuinely thought human eyes worked like built-in flashlights, just shooting actual beams of light into the dark to illuminate the world around you.
Yeah, it was known as the emission theory of vision.
The emission theory.
Exactly. The prevailing consensus back then was that your eye actively projected this like visible fire or energy.
Wow.
And so if it was dark outside, they thought it wasn't because of a lack of sunlight. It was just because your personal, eye beams were either being blocked or they were just rendered ineffective by the surrounding air.
I mean, it sounds completely absurd to us today, right? The idea that we're all just walking around with Superman's heat vision.
Right, yeah.
Just, without the ability to melt steel. It's a hilarious mental image. But correcting that one massive fundamental misconception, that was actually the catalyst for the entire modern science of optics.
It really was.
And unpacking that timeline is exactly what we're doing on this deep dive today. We're exploring the sheer physics of human perception and, well, how the mechanics of our developing eyes and ears actually mirror the spiritual realities of how we process faith, well-being, and our connection to the universe.
Because when you look at the historical progression of this science, especially alongside theological texts, specifically from the golden age of Islamic science and the Qur'an, you find this really profound biological and spiritual parallel.
Right.
But to understand the spiritual weight of how we perceive the world, we first have to understand the hardware. We have to look at the literal physics of how we see it.
And that completely upends the whole ancient flashlight eye theory.
Oh, absolutely.
So to see how that happened, we have to travel back to, the 11th century?
Yeah, the 11th century, to a revolutionary Muslim scientist named Ibn al-Haytham.
Or al-Hazan, as he was often called in the West, I think.
Yes, al-Hazan. And Ibn al-Haytham is just an absolute giant in the history of science because before him, like we said, that Greek emission theory was practically unquestioned gospel.
Right. Everyone just accepted it.
Everyone. But in his defining work, the Book of Optics, he dismantled it completely. And he didn't just, philosophize about it. He proved it through rigorous, replicable experimentation.
Which is huge for the scientific method.
Exactly. He proved that light originates from external sources, so like the sun, the stars, a fire, and that it travels in straight lines, bounces off objects, and then enters the eye.
Okay, but I mean, how exactly do you prove that in the 11th century? Because, if I'm a stubborn Greek philosopher, I could just argue that, my eye beams are what make the sun visible in the first place.
Right, you could try to argue that. But it came down to this brilliant setup using what we call a camera obscura. He basically created a completely dark room and just poked a tiny pinhole in one of the walls. So when sunlight hit objects outside the room, say a tree, the light bounced off that tree, traveled through the pinhole, and projected this perfect inverted image of the tree onto the back wall of the dark room.
Wow, which I guess completely breaks the emission theory?
Exactly.
Because if your eyes were the thing shooting out light to illuminate the tree, a dark room with a hole in the wall wouldn't project an image from the outside inward.
Right. It makes no sense under that theory.
The light has to be traveling independently from the object right into the dark chamber.
You nailed it. The camera obscura modeled the exact mechanism of the human pupil. The room is the eyeball, the pinhole is the pupil, and the back wall is the retina.
That is so smart.
It is. And Ibn al-Haytham mathematically mapped how light enters this small aperture. He even gave us specific anatomical descriptions of the eye that are still foundational today. Like he detailed the cornea, the retina, and the humors.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, when we say humors in this context, we aren't talking about mood or, comedy.
Right. No, the aqueous and vitreous humors. These are essentially the clear, jelly-like, and watery fluids that fill the front and back chambers of your eye.
Okay.
And he mathematically calculated how light refracts or, bends as it passes through the different densities of those fluids to strike the retina.
Wait. How does an 11th century scientist map internal structures like the retina and the fluids without like a modern microscope or medical scanners?
Honestly, through incredibly meticulous physical dissections, which were highly advanced in the Islamic medical tradition at the time. And he combined that with unprecedented mathematical modeling. He basically treated the biological eye as a geometric optical instrument.
That is wild.
Yeah, and his work laid such a massive foundation that 2 centuries later, scientists like Bab al-Din al-Shirazi and his pupil, Kamal al-Din al-Farizi, they actually used his optics to decode something that had always felt like pure magic.
This was...
the rainbow.
Oh, wow. Which, I mean, before this, people basically thought was just some mysterious mixture of light and darkness just painting the sky.
Yes, exactly. But al-Farizi offered the first mathematically sound explanation of it. He took a glass sphere, filled it with water to simulate a single massive raindrop, and he directed a controlled ray of sunlight right into it.
Like a prism.
Exactly like a prism. He demonstrated that the light doesn't just pass through. It enters the water, it refracts or bends, reflects off the back inner wall of the droplet, and then refracts a second time as it exits.
And that splits it.
Yes. That double refraction separates the white light into the color spectrum, superimposing those colors against the dark background of, say, a storm cloud.
So they essentially birthed modern color theory by treating a water droplet like a glass prism. That is brilliant.
It really is.
So Alhazen and his successors, they figured out the intricate hardware of the eye. But the sheer complexity of this optical machine raises this fascinating biological question, like, when does this intricate system actually boot up? Because, surprisingly, despite how dominant human vision is for us, it's actually not the first sense to wake up.
Not at all. Hearing comes first. It always starts with hearing.
Always. And looking at the theological side of this, there is a remarkable consistency in the Qur'an regarding this timeline. Like, looking purely at the textual structure of the verses, they repeatedly list human faculties in a highly specific, unchanging order.
Right.
You see phrases over and over, like in Surah 16, verse 78, it says, "He gave you hearing, sight, and hearts. It is never sight, hearing, and hearts. The auditory sense is always established first."
And when you look at modern embryology, the biological parallels to that ancient text are just striking, because the structures of the inner ear, they develop remarkably early. They start as these things called otic placos.
Otic placos, okay.
Yeah, picture these tiny, thickened patches of cells on the outside of the embryo's head that eventually fold inward to construct the, incredibly complex, fluid-filled mechanics of the inner ear.
And when does that happen?
This happens by the 18th to 20th week of pregnancy. By the 24th to 28th week, a fetus is reliably and consistently responding to sound.
So what are they actually hearing in there at that point?
Well, they're hearing the mother's heartbeat, the rhythmic rush of blood through the vascular system, digestion, and crucially, the muffled sound of voices from the outside world. The auditory pathways are fully active.
It's like being in a perfectly dark room where your only connection to reality is a radio just playing a muffled broadcast of your mother's life.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Because the womb is a world without sunrise. It is a world without color. Sight absolutely must wait until birth, when atmospheric light finally hits the retina. But the fetal brain is already learning, it's already mapping its environment and forming its very first human relationship, which is recognizing the specific frequency of the mother's voice all through hearing, long before the baby ever opens its eyes to see her face.
Wow.
So the undeniable biological timeline of perception is hearing first, then sight.
But the chronological head start of hearing isn't the only unique thing about our ears, right? The mechanical difference between how ears and eyes are built reveals this really profound difference in how we interact with reality itself.
Think about the physical design. I mean, our eyes come with eyelids. They have a built-in shutter.
Yeah, we can blink.
Right. We can choose to close them, to block out the light, to look away from something distressing. But ears, they have no natural lids. They never close. They remain active and online even during deep sleep.
They were basically a biological 247 alarm system.
Precisely. Your auditory pathways are constantly filtering the environment while you sleep, just scanning for anomalies so you can wake up immediately to the sound of a crying baby or, a smoke detector.
That makes a lot of sense.
And this biological reality is connected to a very famous narrative in the Qur'an, the story of the men of the cave in Surah 18.
Oh, right. These were the youths who fled persecution and slept completely undisturbed in a cave for, centuries.
Right. And the text uses a very specific phrasing there. It says, God smote their ears, which is often translated as sealing or drawing a veil over their hearing.
Okay, wait, why the ears specifically?
Because biologically speaking, if you want to put a human being into a state of suspended, centuries-long, uninterrupted sleep, you have to turn off the alarm system. You have to shut down the ear.
Oh, wow. That makes total sense. You can sleep with light hitting your closed eyelids, but a loud noise will just jolt you awake instantly.
Exactly.
And there's a fascinating linguistic nuance in the Arabic of these texts that perfectly captures the difference between these two senses. The Qur'an almost universally uses the singular word for hearing, which is sam, but it uses the plural word for eyes or sight, absar.
Yeah, and why do you think that distinction exists?
Well, thinking about the mechanics you just described, sight is incredibly subjective and isolating, right? You and I could be standing right next to each other in the exact same room. You could choose to look at the ceiling, I could focus on my phone, or I could just close my eyes entirely. We are experiencing plural, fractured, varied visions of the exact same space.
But hearing is a shared, almost compulsory experience.
Right.
If a fire alarm goes off in that room, it doesn't matter where you were looking or if your eyes are closed. Every single person in that room is united by the exact same singular wall of sound at the exact same moment.
You literally can't look away from a sound.
No, you cannot easily choose not to hear it. Hearing forces us into a singular shared reality in a way that sight simply does not.
Which brings up this incredibly thought-provoking idea.
Yeah.
Like, are our senses designed just as much for what they are meant to block out as for what they let in? Because there's this concept that our limited eyesight is actually one of the greatest mercies of human biology.
We do constantly romanticize human vision, don't we? As this pinnacle of evolution, wishing we had eagle eyes or microscopic vision. But the limitations of the human eye are arguably what keep us sane.
I mean, imagine the absolute horror of having microscopic vision. Just imagine trying to eat a simple sandwich. You would look down and see millions of living bacteria crawling across the bread.
Oh, it would be awesome.
You'd see dust mites living on your own eyelashes. You would see microbes swimming in a fresh glass of water. It would just be a constant, overwhelming sensory overload.
Yeah, if we could see the microscopic reality of our environment, we would live in a state of perpetual, paralyzing fear. We wouldn't be able to touch anything. We wouldn't be able to function as a society. So the fact that our visual aperture is narrow, that we cannot see everything, is a profound biological blessing.
Which brings us to the final and probably most complicated piece of that textual sequence. We established the biological timeline, right? Hearing, then sight. But the verses always end with the heart. Hearing, sight, and hearts. But hang on, let's look at the biology again. Because a fetal heart starts beating incredibly early, around 5 to 10 weeks into pregnancy?
Yeah, very early.
That is way before the otic placodes form the ear, and long before the eye fully develops. So if this sequence is meant to be a literal biological timeline, shouldn't the heart be listed first?
That is the exact paradox that has puzzled a lot of readers. It seems like a chronological error at first glance, but there is a brilliant, highly specific scientific explanation for this sequence that focuses on how the fetal heart actually functions, rather than just when its muscles start twitching.
Okay, break that down for me. What is the fetal heart doing differently?
Well, before birth, a baby's lungs are basically deflated and filled with fluid. They aren't breathing air. The fetus gets all of its oxygenated blood from the mother's placenta delivered straight through the umbilical cord.
Right, obviously.
So because the fetal lungs aren't working yet, the fetal heart doesn't need to pump blood to them. So the heart has these special anatomical shortcuts, they're called shunts, like the foramen oval, that literally devote blood away from the lungs.
Oh, so it's essentially acting as a secondary pump on a closed-loop system, just borrowing the mother's lungs. It's not working for itself yet.
Exactly. It is completely dependent on the mother's cardiovascular system. It is only at the exact moment of birth, when the baby takes its very first breath of atmospheric air, that the pressure in the lungs drops.
Wow.
And that massive pressure change forces those shortcuts in the heart to permanently slam shut. The flaps seal. Blood rushes into the baby's lungs for the very first time. Only after that first breath does the heart become a fully operational, independent organ sustaining the human body.
That completely reframes the timeline. If you look at the sequence of when these organs become structurally independent and fully functional on their own, the order is absolutely flawless.
Yes.
I mean, the ears function independently while still inside the womb. The eyes function independently the moment of birth when outside light hits them. And the heart becomes fully structurally independent only after that first breath is taken. Hearing, sight, hearts.
The physical chronology holds up perfectly. But as with everything we're discussing today, the physical completion of the heart is meant to mirror its spiritual completion. The biological hardware is just the foundation for the spiritual reality.
So how do the eyes and ears impact that spiritual reality once we are, fully grown and walking around?
The overarching theological perspective is that the eye isn't just a passive organ of observation. It is an active, highly influential aperture, a gateway that directly feeds the spiritual heart. And when you understand the sheer processing power of the eye, you understand why it holds so much influence over our inner state.
Because, the biological stats in the eye are staggering. A single human eye weighs less than 30 grams.
Barely anything.
Yeah, yet it contains over 200 million working parts. It connects directly to the brain via 1 million nerve fibers, and it processes roughly 36,000 pieces of visual information every single hour. It's actually estimated that sight accounts for 80% of all our environmental awareness.
And because it processes that massive amount of data, the eye heavily dictates the health of the spiritual heart. In the Islamic theological tradition, scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim wrote extensively on the dangers of unchecked vision.
What do they say?
They argued that constantly letting your eyes linger on illicit, lustful, or purely materialistic things is like shooting a poisoned arrow directly into the heart.
Wow, a poisoned arrow. It makes me think of the eye like a massive high-bandwidth fiber optic cable plugged directly into your server, which is your heart.
That's a great analogy.
If you are constantly using that massive bandwidth to download malware, endless doom scrolling, looking at what your neighbors have with envy, consuming illicit content, eventually the whole system gets corrupted. The server crashes.
That is a highly accurate modern translation of what those scholars were saying. They argued that what you passively let your eyes consume scatters your focus, fuels negative desires, and ultimately creates a barrier between a person and the divine. But the inverse is also true. By guarding that fiber optic cable, you elevate the heart.
Which introduces the concepts of basira and farasa, right?
Yes. Basira translates to a deep spiritual insight, and farasa is a type of divine intuition or clarity. The theological belief is that by intentionally lowering the gaze, by actively choosing not to look at things that corrupt the mind, even when you have the biological power to do so, you block spiritual darkness.
You filter the data.
Exactly. And in return, you cultivate an illuminated, intuitive heart. You are essentially trading cheap physical sight for profound spiritual vision.
And this deeply connects to one of the divine names of God mentioned in these traditions, Al-Basir, the all-seeing.
It does. It ties into a foundational tradition known as the Hadith of Jibril.
Okay, what is that?
For context, a hadith is a recorded saying or action of the Prophet Muhammad, and Jibril is the Arabic name for the angel Gabriel. So in this specific tradition, Gabriel asks what the highest state of spiritual excellence is. The answer given is to worship as if you can see the divine, knowing that even though your physical eyes cannot see him, he sees you.
It's a profound state of continuous mindfulness.
Yes.
If you genuinely internalize that all-seeing presence, you naturally become hyper-aware of what you allow your own eyes to take in. You treat your vision as something sacred.
Absolutely.
And that incredible reverence for the vulnerability and sacredness of the eye that shows up in the historical accounts of physical miracles from this era too.
It does. The historical traditions place a massive emphasis on the healing of the eye, specifically. And the accounts are very visceral. For example, there is the tradition of Hubayb bin Fudayk's father. The historical texts say he was training a horse, accidentally stepped on a snake's egg, and was bitten. The venom caused his eyes to turn completely white, leaving him totally blind.
Oh my gosh.
But according to the tradition, the Prophet Muhammad blew into his eyes, and the man's sight was entirely restored. The texts claim the healing was so flawless that even at 80 years old, he could still easily thread a needle.
That's incredible. And there's similar accounts from the battlefield too, like the companion Abu Dar, who suffered a severe eye injury at the battles of Uhud and was healed. But the most dramatic account has to be Qatada bin Nu'man at the Battle of Badr.
Yes, that is a striking historical narrative. The texts describe Qatada suffering a blow to the face so severe that his eyeball was literally dislodged from the socket and was hanging down his cheek.
Just horrifying.
The injury was so horrific that his fellow companions believed it was a lost cause, and they wanted to surgically cut the eye off. But the Prophet instructed them not to. Instead, he took the dislodged eye, placed it back into the socket with his palm, and prayed over it. The tradition states the healing was so absolute that Qatada later couldn't even tell which of his eyes had been the injured one. It actually became his best-seeing eye.
Wow. And whether you approach those historical accounts as literal physical events or as powerful traditions of faith, the underlying message is identical. The eye is incredibly fragile, profoundly vulnerable, and immensely precious. It is not something to be taken for granted or used carelessly.
It acts as the ultimate bridge. It bridges the physical world of bouncing light and camera obscuras that scientists like Ibn al-Haytham decoded with the internal spiritual world of the heart that the theologians mapped out.
So we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started with the absurdity of ancient Greek flashlight eyes.
Always a fun place to start.
Yeah. We moved through the brilliant physical physics of light during the Islamic Golden Age. We went inside the womb to understand why the biological alarm system of the ear awakens long before the eye. We decoded the hidden mechanics of the fetal heart. And finally, we explored why guarding our physical sight is the key to protecting our spiritual heart. The overarching lesson woven through all these sources is that the journey of knowledge, much like the timeline of human biology, it begins with listening.
It absolutely does. But I want to leave you with one final, frankly chilling exception to everything we've just discussed today.
Oh.
Yeah, we've established that the sequence is always hearing, then sight. Except in one highly specific context.
Wait, where is the exception?
In Surah 32, verse 12, the text shifts to describing the day of judgment. And in this single instance, the sequence is flipped. Sight is mentioned before hearing. The verse describes people standing before the divine, bending their heads and saying, "Our Lord, we have seen and we have heard."
Why flip the order at the very end of time?
Because the implication is that on that day, the overwhelming, universe-altering realities will be seen before a single word is spoken and before the mind can even process a sound. The visual shock of that reality will completely bypass the ear and precede everything else. It is a stark reminder that while we live in a world where hearing comes first, a moment is approaching where sight will utterly dominate our perception. It invites us to deeply ponder what it means to guard our senses today, so that our hearts are fortified and prepared for what our eyes will eventually witness.
That is a heavy but incredibly powerful thought to end on. If our eyes truly are the high bandwidth aperture to the heart, we need to be incredibly intentional about what we allow to pass through that lens. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a moment today to just pause. Close your eyes, listen to the specific sounds of your surroundings, and appreciate the hidden, complex miracles happening right inside your own head. Until next time.